Hello, my name is Benjamin Hart. I'm an American attorney and the managing director of Integrity Legal here in Bangkok, Thailand. As the title of this video suggests, although it's probably not real explanatory to those who are unfamiliar with both the situation as well as the terminology, we're talking about the collapse, and I don't think that's being hyperbolic to use that terminology, as it is my understanding that FDIC basically took control of the Silicon Valley Bank at the end of last week, Friday. This is here in March of 2023. So a lot of folks out there on YouTube, across the internet, just all over the place talking about the Silicon Valley Bank essentially shutting down. And so this is not something that's, particularly big news in the sense of this channel, nor is it something we would normally be talking about, except for the minute it happened, a little bell went off on the inside of my head, and I started thinking about things people have been talking about with respect to the movement of both capital and expertise into Asia over the course of the past few decades. And when I saw that Silicon Valley Bank, and this thing is not a bank in the sense that, it's my understanding it's the second largest bank collapse in U.S. history, second only to what occurred in 2008-ish, the so-called Great Recession back in the United States. I remember that very well. I was in transition to being over here in Asia, specifically here in Thailand. And so this is pretty big news, I think, in a general sense. But something I've been thinking about, I remember reading an article some time ago, it's a long time ago, but it's been in the back of my head, where they talked about how not only did financial centers tend to move, and the tendency tended to be west, if you're looking at it from sort of a European perspective. It was in London, then it moved to New York, and there's arguments that financially it may have moved back to London. But as far as innovation, that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this Yuasa phenomenon. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, if it's Uwasa or whatever. And I'm taking this from Wikipedia, so again, consider the source, but general information. Wikipedia is a pretty good source on the internet. Yuasa phenomenon, named after Japanese physicist and science historian Mitsutomo Yuasa, sometimes referred to as Mintomo Yuasa, suggests that in the modern era, the world center of scientific activity, defined as producing more than 25% of the world's scientific achievements, moves from one country to another about every 80 to 100 years. Analyzed data suggests that, quote, modern world science center has shifted from Italy, 1504 to 1610, to the United Kingdom, 1660, 1750, to France, 1760 to 1840, Germany, 1875, 1920, and the United States, 1920 to the present. Quoting further, the phenomenon and its study methodology are an emerging scientometrics, whatever that means, scientometrics study area. Indicators are pointing to China rise, I think it meant China's rise, as a world center of scientific activity. This phenomenon is also described by other names, including the Bernal-Yuasa phenomenon. So again, I kind of was seeing this in the context of financial centers, but financial centers tend to kind of tether to, although not be totally, completely tied to, where the center of sort of scientific innovation is. I think it's pretty well undisputed that roughly the last at least 20 years, but I think you could argue 25 to 30 maybe years, that Silicon Valley has been the undisputed epicenter of scientific discovery, especially scientific discovery, quote unquote, occurring in a financially sort of windfall kind of environment. What do I mean? Sort of the Wild West of tech. Basically, like where you're basically in a situation where tech is not only being innovated, but it's being innovated for a profit very quickly. And it's my understanding that SVB, or Silicon Valley Bank, was a real facilitator of this phenomenon. Now, I've also kind of been reading things, and this is just me, the layman, talking here, reading things about tech and sort of the way things are going, hardware, software. There are some arguments to be made, I guess, based on things I've read from others, that maybe Silicon Valley is not the center of innovation that it once was, that there are other places. Meanwhile, finance, that's another big issue. You know, to say New York is the center of finance now, the financial world, I think that's pretty hard to make that claim these days in light of a lot of other developments. Most notably the fact that a lot of the financial centers in New York moved to Florida, mostly because they didn't want to deal with all the nonsense that came about as a result of everything that happened between 2020 and 2022, or even 2023, resulting from all the restrictions and things that were imposed on them with regard to doing business, for example, in the state of New York. Leaving all that aside, at the end of the day, in sort of a broad historical context, these financial centers and these centers of innovation move. They move over time. The tendency tends to be sort of west from Europe, as we've seen, but it may be shifting in an even bigger way, I think, in the sense that it may have jumped over the Pacific now, or maybe in the process of jumping the Pacific. And I'm going to be really interested. I'm not saying there's a causal relationship between this Silicon Valley Bank thing. What I think this is, it's a watershed moment, or maybe better to put it as, it's a marker, a canary in the coal mine, if you will, where we can look back and say, oh, that was kind of the moment that the tipping point was hit, and yeah, Asia was the epicenter from that point forward of technological and innovation, and thereby also was a major epicenter in terms of financial innovation and financial clout as well. Now, exactly how this plays out remains to be seen. I'm not convinced it goes to any one place, by the way. There's a lot of, oh, it's going to move to China. Well, China's very good at certain things, and they're not very good at certain other things. I mean, there's been kind of comparative advantage out there where, you know, different countries have gotten very good at different things. Japan, for example, has its own specialties. Korea has its own specialties. China is what it is. And then you even look at other jurisdictions, which I don't even think most Westerners are really looking at, most particularly down here in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand. A lot of business has moved out of China in the last roughly 3 or 4 years. I think even more will do so, as we've seen and discussed in other videos. Amazon is putting in a major infrastructural project into Thailand, and in the Eastern Economic Corridor, we're also seeing a lot of innovation going on down there. That's to say nothing of other jurisdictions. Vietnam, as I already mentioned, but Malaysia, Philippines, even Indonesia could get into the mix, as it were, with respect to this major, possibly major shift. I think we're going through, especially here in the 2020s, we're going through just a demographic shift, not only into, you know, there's the whole Strauss and Howe fourth turning thing you can get into. I don't really get into that stuff on this channel, but I love reading about it. I think it's even more profound than that. I think what we're seeing is essentially a return to the mean if you look at the broader historical context, that, yeah, for a brief moment, the West, quote unquote, what I would even call, oftentimes I think this is a good label, the colonial powers, yeah, they got really far ahead economically because they essentially developed guns quicker than anybody and artillery capabilities, which allowed them to basically conquer places at a much more rapid pace. And yes, there was capital that came from that, and yes, there was development associated with that. I'm not saying it was all bad. I'm not saying it was all good either by any stretch. The point I'm trying to make is, if you go back along a longer timeline of history, Asia, especially East Asia, was always the epicenter of major economic development. That it was always viewed as the rich part of the world, quote unquote. You know, the riches of Asia, et cetera, et cetera. I remember recently reading an article about Mark Antony and how Mark Antony, you know, desiring to go over to the Eastern Roman Empire and becoming kind of ensconced in the East, it was just kind of an example of how Western men primarily, but Westerners in general, have always kind of viewed the East and how they've sort of acclimated into it when they get into the East, which is, you know, it's in some ways more Spartan in the West compared to the East in certain ways. Again, not to go too deep into that, but I just thought this was really interesting. The minute I saw the news specifically about this specific bank, I started thinking of this phenomenon. And I'm not saying this is happening, but I definitely think it's worth looking at because I think it's pertinent for the times and the situation that we're currently in.